Drawing digitally is all about hitting a few key steps that every artist, no matter their style, can agree on. You start with a sketch to figure out your idea, then refine it with clean line art. Throw in some colors, and finally bring it to life with shadow and highlights. This basic framework is what most digital artists follow, but here's the thing, it's just a framework. While we all work towards the same milestones, we don't all take the same path to get there. Hi, my name is NAKA, and over the last decade I fine-tuned my own process to make the journey smoother. I started out just like everyone else, trying to figure out at least a way to approach each step. But what I found was all the constant decision-making, especially in the early stages, kept pulling me off track. I hated being stuck in one part of the process for too long, but more importantly, I didn't like the stress committing to a choice that might be harder to change later. So I developed a way to get through those boring, uncertain parts faster with way less pressure. By using non-destructive methods, things like layer mask or adjustment layers, I gave myself the room to breathe. No more worrying if something was perfect right away, I could always tweak it later without losing real progress. In this video, I'm going to show you how this system works by simply making a character design, so you can stop getting bogged down and start creating without the usual roadblocks. Starting with our first milestone, sketching. For the sake of cleaning our scope, let's separate it to 3 different phases: ideation, draft, and preparation. This time I'm not starting with a clear goal, so my first challenge is the empty canvas. During the ideation phase, I throw down anything that comes to mind, good, bad, or completely nonsensical. The point isn't to create something polished, but to explore ideas and ease into the drawing session. Think of it as a warm-up. At this stage, sketches don't need to look good, they can be rough, messy, even downright ugly. No one will ever see them unless, of course, you decide to make a YouTube video about it. Once I find an idea that sparks my interest, I move to the next phase. Since the sketch won't be part of the final illustration, I don't need any complex techniques here. My only goal is to block out the big shapes and emphasize what stands out to me. A simple but effective trick for this stage: don't zoom in. Keeping everything visible at once helps maintaining shape balance and prevents me from getting lost in details. My tool of choice are the brush and eraser, keeping things rough and sketchy. I also use the lasso tool to grab and stretch part around with the transform tool. It's a destructive approach, but way faster than redrawing. Since I don't yet know exactly how the final piece will look, I fill the character with flat gray to get a better read on the silhouette. And even though this video is about featuring non-destructive methods, I go ahead and merge some layers for easier liquefying and quick adjustments. A bit of extra values to refine the silhouette, and the final canvas flip to catch mistakes. Yep, she is tilted. Can the transform tool fix it? Yes, it can. Moving to the last phase of sketching, I start refining key details with a rough pass over the most important lines. This layer serves as a guide for the line art, so my focus is on keeping the strong shapes and defining any uncertain areas. Still in sketch mode, so zooming in is off limits. At this stage I also add extra details that weren't present before, anything that might make her design more interesting. And right now she is basically a potato on 2 sticks. Not exactly the most balanced look. Time to fix that. To give the bottom half more weight, I go with an unnecessarily large hairlock, keeping the same metal hairpiece, but sizing it up for better proportions. Is this hairstyle practical? Absolutely not, but I'm not about to argue with logic, I already sacrificed it on the altar of the rule of cool. With the sketch logged in, it's time to prep for line art. Recoloring the sketch lines and silhouette helps make the line art stand out clearly. And of course, naming and organizing layers into folders now saves me from future chaos. As you can see, the entire process up to this point has been sketching, but with different goals at each stage. First, we sketch to generate an idea, then we sketch to explore and refine it. And finally, we sketch to build up a solid foundation for what comes next. This part is pretty straightforward, but there is still a rhythm to it. I start by outlining a section, then slowly build up the details, adding just enough to detail shape and flow. No need to draw every individual hair strand, instead I use lines to suggest the movement of the braided lock. This is more of a personal preference. I like keeping more variation in the level of detail rather than making everything too uniformly detailed. You might have noticed another trick. I create a new layer whenever I'm unsure about the detail. This way I can experiment without the fear of ruining previous work. Once I'm happy with it, I merge the layers back together. Since the oversized hair lock is already a statement piece, I keep it less detailed than her hair on the top. I don't want it to competing with her legs for attention. Right now I'm not sure if it's enough, but that's not a problem. The line art stays on its own layer throughout the whole session, so if I ever need to adjust something later, I can. Up until now, everything has been pretty standard, just the brush, eraser and a few basic layers. But here is where things getting interesting. For me, coloring has two phases: color masking and detailing. So let's see what color masking does. Instead of adding a new layer for colors like most people do, I stay on the line art layer and select everything outside of the character, then I run a custom coloring script I made. What does it do? Expands the selection so the edge falls in the middle of the line art instead of next to it. Inverts the selection to put it on the character. Creates a folder under the line art layer, generates a layer mask from the selection, and finally adds a solid color adjustment layer, filling the mask with a flat color that can be changed anytime with a simple double click on its thumbnail. But why go through all of this instead of just making a layer and coloring it? Because it's not just faster, but also accelerates further steps. Anything dropped into this folder stays contained within the character's silhouette thanks to the layer mask. Like clipping layers, but with way more flexibility. You can still use clipping layers inside the folder, stacks mask folders within it, and easily tweak the mask with a brush or eraser if anything needs fixing. It does all with a simple click. If you want the script, you can find it on my Patreon. Once everything is filled with a flat color, I realized the line art needs some tweaking. Instead of repainting or using the lasso tool, I just liquefy it. Small nudges to push things into place. But now the color folder doesn't line up. Easy fix. If you select the layer mask and hit Ctrl+F, it reapplies the last use filter, adjusting everything instantly. Expect, I forgot that and manually overpainted the changes instead. Whoops. Since I already making tweaks, I added a sketch layer to plan out her clothing details, then refine it into line art. And by the way, just because the process has distinct phases, that doesn't mean you can't jump back and adjust things whenever needed. That's the power of not merging layers. Now that the mask folder is set up, I drop a layer and start coloring the hair. The exact color doesn't matter yet, just the edges. Once filled, I hit Ctrl+U to bring up the hue and saturation panel, tweak it until it looks good, then apply. I repeat this for each color, add a new layer below, fill it with a base color, adjust hue and saturation, move on the next one. Each time a new layer is added, the one above it hides excess strokes, making the process faster and faster since there are fewer edges to worry about. Now that the base color are in, it's time to mess with the values. I'm not great at color theory, so my method is simple. Mess around and find out. I pick a layer, adjust hue and saturation, and experiment. The general rule is, at least one color should be more saturated than the rest, luminosity should vary, nothing should be uniformly dark or light, and everything being the same color is kind of a no-go. Since later steps won't be destructive, I don't need everything to be perfect right now. This is where I add small touches like whites of the eyes, some band-aids on the skin, or some reds to make the skin feel more alive. I don't add shadows yet, so keep that in mind, because that's a separate step. Tattoos could make the skin more interesting, but I'm undecided yet, so I leave them on a separate layer in case I change my mind later. To make detailing easier, I create mask folders for the boots, pants, metal parts, hair and the hoodie. This lets me paint freely without worrying about staying inside the lines. This part is mostly about figuring out those extra details, and sometimes it requires going back and drawing some extra line art. So, to summarize everything, create color masks that are easy to handle, then mess around and find out what flat colors looks the best. Add some details for those parts that feel a bit boring or pale. Once everything looks good, it's time to go for the next milestone. I create a new folder and Alt+ drag the layer mask from the coloring folder. Now I have a dedicated folder for all the light and shadow related layers. As a foundation, I add a black layer and reduce the opacity. This lets me set the dark values while also evening out the saturation across the entire piece. The next layer is also black with reduced opacity, but this time I'm painting ambient occlusion, shadows that form where two surfaces are too close together regardless of any light source. My personal preference is that I make these shadows angular, almost like tiny triangles. Now that we added shadows to an already dark character, it's time to bring in some light. I start with a color dodge layer with reduced fill instead of opacity. This makes the color pop more naturally under the light. I grab a white brush and paint light on the character, staying zoomed out to get a better read on the overall form. Instead of overthinking cast shadows, I find it much easier to just imagine a light source and paint wherever it hits. I'm intentionally being a bit sloppy here because this layer will be softened later, adding some visual noise for the real lighting pass. Next, I create a white layer, set it to color dodge 40% fill and use it as a mask to hold the layer properties. Then I clip a flat yellow layer on top of it, making the light warmer and easier to adjust later. I go back to the white layer and start erasing areas where the light wouldn't naturally reach. I also add some light to the bottom of the character to enhance the sense of volume, just enough to do the job. Once that's done, I Ctrl+click on the thumbnail of the light layer to create a selection, then press Ctrl+I to invert it. On a new layer, I paint red along the edges, making the Terminator line, a result of subsurface scattering in real life, where the light penetrates the surface and creates a soft glow. In reality, it's rarely this visible and completely non-existent on metal, but if it looks cool, I drew it. Of course, the final version won't be this intense, but exaggerating it helps me see what I'm doing. Final adjustments, and we are almost there. Most people start by drawing shadows, but personally, I prefer to darken the entire character first, then bring in the light. This way, instead of spending time painting areas that won't even be that visible, I'm actively highlighting the focal points, making the lighting feel more intentional and controlled. This is the step that so many people skip. Not because it's unnecessary, but because it's often overlooked. It doesn't take much effort, barely any time, yet it elevates the final piece, making everything more polished and unified. So what it exactly do? For me, it ties the whole image together, smooths out smaller mistakes, and gives the piece a more professional finish. I start with a color lookup adjustment layer. Basically a built-in color filter, kind of like an Instagram effect for Photoshop. It does a great job enhancing the midtones, but I notice it oversaturates the brighter colors a bit too much. To fix that, I double-click the layer to open layer styles and adjust the blend if settings. By moving the slider on the lighter end, the effect starts to fade out in the highlights. Holding Alt while dragging splits the slider, creating a smoother transition instead of a harsh cutoff. Next, I use Hue and Saturation adjustment layer and drop the saturation all the way down to grayscale. Same trick as before, blend if to make sure it only affects the darker part of the image. A quick slider split, and now I have the layer that naturally desaturates shadows where colors wouldn't be visible in real life. No light, no color. Now I flatten all visible layers into a new one using Ctrl-Shift-Alt+E. This gives me a meshed copy without losing my layer structure. I head to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, setting it to 0.4 pixels, just enough to soften digital edges and give the lines a slight photoscanned feel rather than something purely digital. To counteract the slight blur, I duplicate the layer and go to Filter, Other, High Pass, setting it to 2.5 pixels. This results a flat gray layer with sharp edge details. Switching its blend mode to overlay sharpened the image without messing with the brightness or saturation thanks to the 50% gray base. Now for a bit of texture. I create a new layer, fill it with 50% gray, then go to Filter, Filter Gallery and apply film grain with my preferred settings. Another Gaussian blur at 0.4 pixels, then I set the layer mode to overlay. This adds a subtle noise layer, making the image feel more natural without actually affecting the colors or values. You can still adjust the opacity of it, so you can reduce it as much you want. And finally, the finishing touch, chromatic aberration. Another Ctrl-Shift-Alt+E to create a new flatten layer, then I switch from layers to channels. I select a single color channel, turn the RGB visibility back on by clicking the eye icon, and use Ctrl+A to select everything, Ctrl+T to bring up the transform tool, and with a few taps on the arrow keys I slightly offset the color channels. Once I hit enter, I deselect with Ctrl+D and repeat the process for the other channels if needed. My only issue with chromatic aberration is that sometimes it feels too digital. A quick fix is to change the layer mode from normal to color. It gives it a subtle CRT screen vibe, making it more analog and less artificially processed. And that's it, the final tweaks are in place and the piece is done. So, here we are. A fully finished piece, but not a logged-in final. Thanks to this workflow, everything stays adjustable, making it easy to tweak, experiment with different lighting setups, color palettes, or even new patterns without starting over. If you want to mess around with the PSD yourself, you can grab it from my Patreon. I've done a few extra retouches and included a short breakdown video to make things cleaner. And if you do experiment with it, feel free to share your results in our Patreon Discord. I love to see what you come up with. And speaking of Patreon, huge thanks to these amazing people for their support. You are the reason this is all possible. Also, thank you for sticking around. I hope I showed you something new to try. I'm still figuring out this whole YouTube thing, so I'm experimenting with basically everything at this point. If you like or don't like any changes, I love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to see where this channel goes next, consider subscribing, or thanks if you already have. See you in the next one.